Governor, firstly, thanks very much for taking time out to speak with ET. Now, to begin with, you opted for a 50 basis point cut in the repo rate, which is somewhere being viewed as a rather aggressive step by the markets. Do you worry that this could potentially further stoke inflationary pressures?
First of all, thank you, George, for this opportunity to be on ET now. Yes, some people have said that the 50 basis points hike was aggressive, and that's fair criticism on par for the course. But let me explain the motivation for the what the market considers aggressive rate hike. First, look at the growth numbers that had come. Okay? Growth last year, quarter by quarter, it slipped 7.7% in the first quarter to 6.9% in the second quarter to 6.1% in the third quarter. Investment had gone negative in the second and third quarters last year. On the other hand, look at inflation numbers. Inflation, which had ruled headline inflation, which had ruled above 9% for the last 2 years, had come below 7%. Core inflation, that's non-food manufactured product inflation, which peaked at 8.4% in November 2011, had printed below 5% in March. Indeed, at 4.7%, it had come below 5% for the first time in 2 years, and is close to the long period average of about 4.5%. So headline inflation has come down, core inflation has come down, growth has moderated. Also remember that when we hiked rates in October 2011, inflation headline was about 10%, core was over 8%. So with the recognized moderation in growth, reduction in inflation, in calibrating the 50 basis points reduction in the policy rate. If your question is this going to unhinge inflation expectations, so fuel inflation? I don't believe that will happen, because our indication, which we have stated in the policy, is that inflation will remain range bound this year. Of course, there are risks of fiscal deficit, oil prices, rupee depreciation, the monsoon outlook, food inflation, particularly in protein, but I believe that we've taken into account those risks in calibrating this policy rate.
Sure, but Governor, you have spoken about the various risks to inflation that still remain, and you will agree that the numbers, the headline numbers in inflation coming off over the last couple of months has in large part been because of a favorable base effect. So the question really was in that context where inflationary pressures continue to persist. You've talked about wage price inflationary pressures, food price inflation, protein food products and things like that. So in an environment like that, where you've actually had only the base effect in large part support the headline number coming off, a rate cut, do you worry that it could bring back inflation, was the question really?
Yeah, that was what I thought I was answering to. There are risks to inflation, but you must recognize that aggregate demand has slowed, pricing power of corporates has come down, the margins have thinned out, so their ability to pass on high input prices as high output prices is quite limited. So I do not rule out the possibility of inflation spiking up again, but I believe that the probability is quite small at this time.
So now, I'm sure you won't agree with this, but there's a growing view in the market again that somewhere North Bloc is very strongly influencing monetary policy decision making. Would you agree to that?
No, I don't think so. I would not agree with that, as you had predicted. The rate action yesterday decision was entirely done by the RBI in our best professional judgment.
So now, in your guidance, you have said that growth in inflation considerations inherently limit the scope for further rate reduction. Now, what the markets are making of this is that the RBI has said that, look, I'm doing my part. I've done a big 50 basis point cut on the repo. Now it is for you to focus, or rather look to the center, look to New Delhi, because they need to fix issues like supply side constraints. They need to fix issues of subsidies. And really the onus of fixing the economy at large is not the RBI's, but the central government's. Is that a fair assumption to make?
Well, yes, that's a fair characterization of the situation, but with slightly different nuancing. I wouldn't pit the government and RBI as adversaries, but as being involved together, synergistically in economic management. And as much as monetary policy has a role and responsibility for inflation management, a lot of supply side responses to come in if we need to bring inflation down on a sustainable basis. So I believe yesterday's action will generate or trigger the supply response, but as I said at the press conference, our rate reduction is a necessary but not a sufficient condition.
So now you did, I mean, just going back to the point of inflation, you did say that the upside risks to inflation remain, but despite that you've gone ahead with this policy rate cut. Now, should the inflation picture worsen from here, is it safe to assume that the RBI will not hesitate in reversing the policy rate cut?
Yes and no, okay? Because the probability of inflation spiking and the probability of RBI tightening once again is non-zero but small. But it is not as if we're going to respond mechanically to a surge in inflation. We will look at what the drivers of inflation are and how sustained or strong they might be. For example, people are talking about, or an issue in this regard is the possible inflation on account of adjustment in petroleum product prices. Certainly that will have an impact on headline inflation and it will have an impact on relative prices. But whether that will translate into generalized inflation will depend on, as I said a short while ago, on the pricing power, on the demand, aggregate demand in the economy. Okay? Pricing power has come down, so the likelihood of that transmitting to generalized inflation is low. But should we come to a conclusion, should we make a determination that demand pressures are resurging once again, we will have to reverse our policy action.
Right now, just in the same point, you said that the risk of adjustments in administered prices translating into generalized inflationary pressures remain limited. Isn't that a rather optimistic view to take? Because in the case of petrol, when we saw petrol prices deregulated, the assumption was that people would consume the fuel more responsibly. That really hasn't happened. So would the assumption that you've made over here be a little optimistic?
I believe not, and for two reasons. First, about the pricing power being limited, and therefore the limited ability of input prices translating into output prices. Second, about price elasticity of demand for petroleum products. Yes, we've not seen as much of demand response to past price hikes, but the demand curve is not linear. So at a certain point of time, I believe that the response, demand response will be stronger, and that should happen.
Now, in the macroeconomic report that you put out on Monday, you said that the policy design hinges on deregulation and the upward adjustment of oil prices, which would provide for space for fiscal and monetary policy to work together in achieving growth and inflation objectives. Could you just explain that a little more for us?
Well, you know, if fiscal deficit is high, that will add to aggregate demand, that is inflationary. On the other hand, you can reduce fiscal deficit under the current circumstances. Possibly the only way to reduce fiscal deficit in the short term is to reduce subsidies. And as we spoke a short while ago, that is inflationary too. Okay? So either way, whether you do it or not do it, you're having inflationary pressures. But we believe that the economy will be best served if administered prices are adjusted and pass-through is allowed. For again, for what we spoke about just now, for efficiency reasons and for curbing demand. So it will allow, if fiscal deficit comes down, it will allow monetary policy to manage inflation more effectively.